This is the second part of our series on the impossible state. In this video, we will cover some of the major contradictions between Islamic governance and the modern state, and some of the major reasons why these two cannot be reconciled, or we cannot simply just put Sharia into the modern state apparatus. So in the previous video, we covered first two chapters, premises and the modern state. Now we are going to cover two more chapters, the separation of powers, the legal, the political, and the moral. So let's start with the third chapter, separation of powers. Now, this chapter is about debunking the belief of the separation of powers in the modern state, that laws are given by legislature, implemented by an executive, and interpreted by a judiciary, and then showing how separation of powers worked in the Islamic governance. So, the first part is separation of powers in the nation state, and then we will see separation of powers in Islamic governance. It is a popular belief that in modern nation state, separation of powers ensures that there is no concentration of power, and that in turn ensures democracy. And this sounds like an ideal thing, but in reality, this theory is riddled with so many exceptions and inconsistencies. Halak says the best argument is that this is at least the best and most successful form of rule of the 20th century, but this is no reason for its acceptance. Like many critics, Kelsen has argued that there is not so much separation of powers, but distribution of powers, or that one branch specializes in one function instead of just being confined to one function. This breakdown of separation of powers is obvious in the case of legislative and the executive. Executives and courts also make laws, reinterpret laws, and sometimes override laws, and this all blurs the lines of separation. Administrative independence and a lack of presidential control over a considerable portion of the executive is said to have created, out of administrative and certain executive agencies, a headless fourth branch of government, one that appears to possess an autonomous status. Party politics further undermines this separation. When same party controls different branches, competition disappears and it causes the power to concentrate. The executive gains more authority while the legislative often gives up power willingly. Courts or judiciary is not neutral guardian, standing outside party politics. Judges are citizens and they are shaped by class, education, ideology, and loyalty to the state. Even when laws are unjust, courts usually enforce them and legitimize state's power. Executive sometimes legislates and then execute its own legislation. All this causes the reduction of power of legislative and concentration of power of executive, and it undermines the rule of law and democracy. Halak quotes Hans Kelsen, who says that separation of powers even is not democratic, as people should be having the power in the form of one main elected body, the legislative, and others should be subservient to it. The second part is the paradigm of Islamic governance. Halak says that there never was an Islamic state. The state is modern, and by modern, he means a particular structure of relations that makes it unique. The foundations or paradigms of both are dramatically different. In Islam, the community ummah is the quote-unquote nation, and wherever the Sharia is paradigmatic is Dar al-Islam, and wherever it is not is Dar al-Harb. Whereas the nation state is end of all ends, in Islamic governance the sovereign is God and God alone, and that sovereign will is expressed in Sharia, which articulated the moral principles through law. God owns everything, and everyone's wealth and possessions are God's, and the poor have the right on it. So there is a dialectic relationship between sociological and metaphysical in Sharia. So this makes it clear that there can be no Islamic state. A state is not state without the essential form property of sovereignty, but in Islamic governance, the sovereign is the God. This point leads us to different implications, and one of those implications is that Sharia regulates the entire range of human order, and it is the legislative, and it makes all other institutions subservient to it, including the judicial and the executive, and the executive power was mandated by the Sharia to legislate in limited spheres. Sharia was a bottom-up system, as the community, the common social order, organically produced its own legal experts, and those jurists lived within the common social world and were responsible to the society and served it, and they were the exemplars of the virtuous Muslim lifestyle, and they were religious and moral authority. Muftis were responsible to society and the people, and the judges consulted them and they gave fatwas, and these fatwas and not court decisions were recorded and published. Once edited and abstracted, fatwas became part and parcel of legal doctrine. The majority of legal works were written by author jurists who depended on fatwas, and these works were standard for judges who studied these during their student life and referred to these for decisions. So a mufti or an author jurist could usually function as a judge, and they all performed their obligations under Sharia in the world and for the world they lived in. Following this, there was a close relationship between law and society. Litigants clients and consumers appeared before the Qadi without ceremony and presented their cases without professional mediation and in an informal language, which was actually the quote-unquote legal language, because the society and the consumers of law knew the law and their rights, as that society lived legal ethics and legal morality. This was due to the fact that legal knowledge was widespread and easily accessible thanks to the muftis and other legalists who imparted the knowledge free of charge, and all this was due to the vibrant tradition of imparting knowledge even when these scholars were visiting acquaintances, walking in the streets, or shopping in the market. Legal norms and social morality were inseparable. The law applied by the Qadis was a result of the centuries-long tradition of the method of thinking about and interpreting the law that came to be known as usul al-fiqh. And these methods depended upon the concept of ijtihad, which is the process of creative reasoning to arrive at a conclusion using usul al-fiqh. So in the majority, the laws, rules, and regulations were largely the result of ijtihad, and that rested on probability. And due to that, two or more jurists could arrive at different conclusions on the same problem, and there can be anywhere from 2 to a dozen highly reasoned opinions held by different scholars belonging to the same school. Islamic law is one of legal pluralism. It takes into consideration the local customs and offers an array of opinions on the same set of facts. This pluralism caused the Islamic law to be equipped with adaptability and flexibility in governing drastically varied societies, and it caused the law to accommodate new developments in social and economic order. Overwhelmingly, in the interest of population, this legally expressed will was politically binding on the ruler in his dealings with the civil population. The judges were appointed by the ruler, but the ruler played no part in the work of judges between appointment to their dismissal. And this appointment operated on the concept of delegation. In the early days, the caliphs appointed the qadis as their delegation, and after the 9th century, the rulers were not caliphs but sultans. But the main judiciary was completely independent from the executive because they were expected to apply Sharia and its norms and regulations. Now, Lebanese Orientalist Emily Tian argued that the concept of delegation was the complete lack of separation between the judicial and executive powers. But this is highly erroneous because the law is not dependent on the ruler, but the ruler stood under the Sharia law. In Sharia discourse, the ruler is deemed a representative of the community, and his appointment and dismissal of qadis is due to this role. The dismissal from office is regarded by modern observers as undermining judicial independence, but that is not the case in Islamic system. Today's concept of job-based economy did not exist there, and the jurist had other professions than this one. And the normative average tenure of the judge was 2 or 3 years, often renewed after an interval, and so the dismissal was a fact of life and a taken for granted thing. And the paradigmatic moral force of the Sharia compelled judges and rulers to respect judicial independence. So judicial independence was integral to culture. Now, executive was a hired class that was under the obligation to fulfill certain functions. The ruler executed Sharia's ordinances in exchange for the rent that he levied on the populace. The tentative nature of executive sultanism is reflected in the vocabulary, where the term for dynastic rule was dawla, and it connoted a dynastic rule that comes to power in one part of the world and then passes away. But the community remains fixed. Throughout the 12 centuries of Islamic history, the community and Sharia witnessed a relative stability that is rarely attested in human history. Executive rulers stood apart from the legislative, and even the judicial powers, and in many respects, remained subservient to them. Now, there is a Western Orientalist conception of Oriental despotism, which was given weight by the prophetic reports saying 60 years of tyranny are better than 1 day of civil strife. Now, this was taken as evidence for that Orientals are inherently submissive. But actually, this is European monarchies' projection upon Islamic rule, because unlike European monarchs, Islamic rulers could not penetrate society but ruled from outside, and these rulers were constrained by the law. That was not their creation and largely out of their control. In Orientalist definition, the meaning and range of tyranny has been wildly amplified, whereas that of civil strife has been dramatically de-emphasized. The sovereign will of modern state is represented in its own law, but the Islamic ruler did not possess a sovereign will, and he had the contract with the community to uphold Sharia, and in fulfillment of that contract, the ruler was obligated to enforce and execute Sharia court judgments, implement Quranically prescribed hududs, maintain the capacity to raise an army, defend the frontiers and ensure the safety of roads, divide booty after war, collect and redistribute the arms tax, appoint, supervise and dismiss qazis, market inspectors, mint officials in accordance with Sharia, take care of orphaned minors and those without legal guardians. Now, Siyasa Sharia let rulers issue administrative rules, but these rules were not meant to replace Sharia. Most focused on maintaining public order, like dealing with criminals, permitting of torture, etc. And these were criticized by jurists, but they were generally accepted as part of governance. Ordinary people were judged by Sharia courts, while state officials followed a stricter sultanic code. Even the ruler had no immunity under Sharia and could be held accountable like anyone else. Political power was only legitimate if exercised with justice, mercy, and moral responsibility. The ruler was responsible for his officials' wrongdoings and stayed connected to society through councils that included judges and community representatives, keeping governance morally grounded and socially accountable. And that is the end of this chapter. And in this chapter, we looked at the concept of separation of powers and the reality of it in the modern state and then in Islamic governance as well. Now let's move on to chapter 4, the legal, the political, and the moral. And in this chapter, we'll look at two other arguments, the legal and the political, and compare these within modern state and Islamic governance. So let's start with the first one, morality and the rise of the legal. An essential characteristic of modern man is his obsession with gaining knowledge of control, whether it be control of nature or humans. The Enlightenment idea of freedom turned into freedom of control, not just freedom from oppression. So in modern thought, to know something is to gain power over it. As Bacon said, knowledge is power. Thus to know is to engage in power and in transforming the world. It is important for us to understand the connection between this thought structure and morality. Earlier, nature was seen meaningful, value-laden, and guided by moral purpose, but the so-called mechanical philosophers like Newton and Boyle disenchanted the nature, presenting it as devoid of any value, brute and inert, and the matter as spiritually meaningless. And as Boyle said, man was created to possess and to rule over nature. So if nature is brute and inert and it is just a fact without any value, one can deal with it without any moral restraint. All of this caused the separation of fact from value, and this separation caused the emergence of quote-unquote objective and detached science, and everything else like economy, history, business, etc. also started to be studied with detachment, without any moral value, and only for gaining power and control. So now scholars can study the other dispassionately without it making any value-laden or moral demands on it. Hobbes argued that law comes from sovereign's will, not from God or tradition. So it comes from is and not from ought, and it comes from fact and not from value. Human reason decides morality based on society's well-being. Then Austin emphasized that law's validity comes from sovereign, not from whether it's morally right. This is the basis of legal positivism, where law is and morality ought are separate. As everything else in modernity, this is-ought split is presented as universal truth, but it is not, as it is historical and regional. Now Nietzsche outrightly denied the ought altogether, and he said the world is just what it is, a huge, historically and spatially extended brute fact. So Nietzsche took Descartes' dualism to its extreme conclusion, and Austinian legal positivism did not go so far as Nietzsche's scheme, but it also allocated no real place for the moral in the law. Now as we can see, this is in complete contrast to the worldview of Islamic governance. In Islamic tradition, the legal and the moral were recognized as one. There was no word for moral in the modern sense. Quran presents the entire universe as created for the benefit of man, but he is morally accountable for his actions against nature and other human beings. Everything exists to test human conduct, and doing good is the true purpose of life. To be a Muslim or Mu'min is to appreciate and be grateful for everything that God has given. To be kafir is to deny God's good works in nature and to behave badly towards other people. And this iman can only be justified by salihat, good deeds. So the dichotomy of is and ought is modern, and it was and is not present in Sharia, whose legal moral tradition is grounded in cosmic justice and ethical accountability. Now let's look at the second part, sacrifice and the rise of the political. Now the is-ought distinction also caused the rise of the political, which is the term taken from Carl Schmitt, where power becomes the final judge, not the morality. In the world as it is, the final arbiter of things political is power and not morality. Now Halak says the political is the name of an age, just as other ages are characterized as bronze or technological. In this world, the political is not just one area of life, but something that spreads everywhere, shaping law, society, identity, and even personal life. Violence constitutes the main and most reliable source of power in the realm of the political. The political is completely concerned with what is instead of what ought to be. So the defining feature of the political is the friend-enemy distinction. In other words, the political arises when society begins to conceive of its existence as one of violence and war, and being in a state of nature where survival is constantly at stake. So the political pits one collectivity against another collectivity, and no one can look at others like humans. Therefore, citizenship is always being ready to sacrifice oneself for the state, and we take it for granted that no one can live outside of citizenship, for no one can find an independent space outside of state. There is no neutral side between one state and another, and nothing that allows human being to be just human being. Without political state-based affiliation, to be a citizen is to identify oneself with nation-state. As Khan puts it, the political cycle begins when I can imagine myself sacrificing myself and killing others to maintain the state. The modern state has fully arrived not when it defends me against violence, but when it conscripts me into its armed forces. This readiness for sacrifice is taken for granted by the state. It is the state as a successful claimant of life that generated massive level of violence. The modern state does not seek to enter the moral realm, nor is it its duty to make us good. So how does this concept of sacrifice for the sake of a moral entity can fit within the context of Islamic governance? Now, if we look at Islamic governance, warfare was mainly handled by rulers' military army of slave soldiers rather than ordinary civilians. These soldiers were trained from the young age for different military roles and were paid by the state. Ordinary Muslims normally did not engage in war. Many wars and battles of sultans were against each other and did not qualify as jihad. Islamic jurists distinguished between offensive and defensive jihad. Offensive jihad was optional for Muslims, and defensive jihad was when someone attacked on Muslim land, and it was obligatory, but it was moral obligation. There was no punishment in this world for not joining it. Even mundane duties were more important than jihad, and if someone was under debt, he was not allowed to go to war without permission of the debtor. Permission of parents was also required to go into the war. This sharply contrasts with modern state, which enforces conscription and punishes refusal. And that is the end of this chapter. And in this video, we have looked at two chapters, third and fourth, separation of powers, and how that concept is in reality not real, and how that is the case in Islamic governance. And then we looked at the rise of the legal and the rise of the political, and how the moral is relegated to the secondary domain or non-important domain, and how the rise of the legal caused the law to be separated from morality, and how the rise of the political caused the citizens and people to look at other beings as citizens of a particular nation state and not human beings, and where they just see everyone as friend or enemy. And in the next video, we are going to be talking about remaining three chapters, and we will conclude this book.